Great to have you along for the ride. Thanks a lot for stopping by. Glad to have this man on. It's Peter St Onge. He, of course, visiting fellow economics at the Heritage Foundation. It is peterstantonge.com. Peter, how are you? Good to see you again.
I am great. Thanks for having me on, Joe.
Just back from the parade, 40,000. The Dow hit 40,000. I'm supposed to be very happy, even though eggs are $7 a carton. What am I missing?
That's what it is, yeah. Well, the rich get richer. The way that the Fed pumps money into the economy, which it's got to do because the Fed spends so much, the way that it does that is it goes into asset markets. And so all the assets go up. That means your stocks go up, your bonds go up, your houses go up. So that means that anybody who's got money with the Fed on the job is going to get a whole lot more money. And so that's what's driving this rally. Now, the thing that's funny about the stock market right now is that when you dig in, it's all at the top, right? We've got this inverted pyramid where you got 7 companies at the top, these so-called magnificent 7. They're mostly tech companies. Those guys have about 90% of the stock market gains on the S&P 500. The S&P 500 is the 500 biggest companies in America. 7 of them are taking 90% plus of those gains. Wow. You go down below that, you get down to something called the Russell 2000. That's the smaller companies. They've been treading water for 3 years. They're not going anywhere. The Russell is telling you what the economy really looks like, which is that it is a sideways economy with inflation to boot. All that 40,000, that's Nvidia, it's Google, it's Amazon, it's all these kinds of companies.
Why is Nvidia doing so well? I'm a gamer. I've got Nvidia graphics cards. Is it about the chips? Is it about the cards? The cards were really, really expensive about 2 years ago. They have come down in price, but I've heard more about Nvidia in the mainstream lately than I ever have in my life.
Yeah, I've been a shareholder of Nvidia. It's a good company if you're a shareholder.
It is.
They can't make enough chips, right? There's so much money pouring into AI right now. Everybody wants to get AI on it. The sort of dirty secret of AI is that it's incredibly expensive in terms of processing power, right? So like one AI inquiry, it uses like as much electricity as a house uses in a month. I mean, it's insane amounts of electricity, but insane amounts of hardware that stuff needs. So Nvidia literally cannot make it fast enough. They make a chip. They've sold it before they've even made it.
It is Peter St Onge. Go to peterstantonge.com. Follow him, at Prof St Onge over on X. Let me ask you about the inflation rate. Joe Biden has been lying recently, saying that when he took office, it was 9%. It wasn't. It was actually 1.4. It got up to 9.1 in June of 2022. The inflation rate, the way this administration is trying to sell it is, look at the inflation rate is 6 points lower than it was back at its peak, or as he's saying when Trump left office, which is not true. But the inflation rate is the aggregate rate, is it not? Or we don't aggregate it. We say it's 3% this month, it's 3.5 next month, and we pretend like it started from 0 again, which it didn't. Yeah. So if it's 3.5 this month, goes down to 3 next month, we didn't lose the amount of inflation we'd already gained. It actually added another 3%, right?
Right. The inflation is permanent. I mean, it's been a very long time since prices went down. It's been close to 100 years.
Is there such a thing as deflation rate?
Oh, for sure.
Really?
Before we had a Federal Reserve, we had deflation about half the time.
Oh, wow.
In fact, if you go from the beginning of the Republic, so 1787, you go all the way through the evening before the Federal Reserve, we had no inflation. Some years prices went up, some years prices went down. We had zero aggregate inflation. And that's what's funny, right? Because usually when you hear about the Fed, you hear about the Fed fighting inflation. You got to be kidding. The Fed and the Fed alone creates inflation. The way it does that is by printing money. So up until about the 1970s, the word inflation meant printing money. Okay, for hundreds of years, the word inflation in economic context, not a balloon, in an economic context, it meant printing money. Now, if you print money, the prices go up. And so that's why people get confused. They think inflation means prices going up. But when you clear that away, the only cause of inflation is printing money. Now, once you print the money, do those price rises, do they go to housing? Do they go to oil? Do they go to, whatever the supply chain with the washing machines? Okay, that's all economic stuff. That's all nuts and bolts stuff on the ground. But what's driving inflation in the first place is the money printing. So if we didn't have a Federal Reserve, then what would happen is that the total price level would be more or less stable, okay? And then individual things would move around, right? So oil would go up, but if oil goes up, then it drains your pocketbook. Now you're not eating out as much. So restaurant meals would go down, right? It'd be like squeezing a balloon. One part puffs out, the other part comes in. So that's very important. You know, people have been sort of gaslighted by the media, and I think by the education system as well, public schooling. They don't understand where these terms even come from. Inflation only meant money printing because that is what causes the prices to go up.
Great explanation. It's Peter St Onge. Go to follow him at Prof. St Onge over on X. Also go to peterstantonge.com. I've got to ask you, though, what the sales job was. Why did the American public accept that there would be a Federal Reserve? What did the central government say? This is needed because why?
Yeah, and that's an interesting story. So the Federal Reserve, it was set up in 1913, and it was pushed by bankers. These guys, they went and met on this island in Georgia called Jekyll Island, and they took on assumed names because they didn't want anybody to know, because everybody would have assumed, I mean, if all the bankers in America get together, you know something bad is happening, right?
Yes.
What do they got to talk about? So they knew this, and they literally took assumed names, and they all met in secret, and they hatched this plan, which became the Federal Reserve. They pushed it through. They bribed the journalists to get them to write positive articles about the Federal Reserve because the American public did not want this turd sandwich because they knew what was going to happen, which is that it was going to create inflation. At the time, it was called the rubber dollar, right? The dollar at that time was worth 1/20th of an ounce of gold, written in stone since time immemorial, since the beginning of the Republic, right? And they knew what was going to happen. Once you get a central bank in there, the only purpose of a central bank now and forever is to create inflation and to hand the proceeds to the government and to Wall Street, right? So that's exactly what was going to happen. That's how it got pushed through. They bribed the journalists. They probably bribed the politicians, and they got that thing through. And immediately, of course, we got this huge inflationary episode during the 1920s. Prices didn't go up, okay, because we still had a strong economy, so we had technological advancements. The 1920s, they had stuff like you had robot parking spaces in the 1920s. Like, people don't understand how advanced it actually was back then.
Wow.
You had pneumatic tubes where, you know, instead of putting something in the post in the mailbox, you would actually put it in this pneumatic tube and it would shoot across town. You had crazy stuff in the 1920s. Anyway, so all of those inventions were bringing prices down, but then the Fed was printing so much money that it canceled out, right? So people in general didn't see it coming. And then whenever you print money, the problem is that that is going to necessarily lead to a crash, right? That's been known for centuries. It's a boom bust cycle. You print the money goes out to any Tom, Dick, and Harry. Idiots waste it. You get a bunch of stupid companies like .com, you know, pet food boxes, whatever we have running now. WeWork is one of the poster children. Inevitably, when you start printing the money, you are going to have a crash like night follows day. That's what got us the 1930s. Of course, in the 1930s, they blamed it on capitalism because they always do. Now, it's the Federal Reserve. Time and again now, we've had since the Fed has been created, we've had a recession every 5 years. Right, these things are nuts. And
it's got to be on purpose. Well, let me interject this because you got my brain going 18 different ways, which is good. I should think a little bit. Quantitative easing, QE1, QE2, this stuff. Yep. We were told as the American public, we have to do this or there will be a depression. So that saved us from the depression by printing trillions of more dollar bills. So it's the opposite that happens?
Yeah, so what happens is when you print the money, you get this kind of tissue fire. Okay, basically anybody can get money. And so consumers spend, they go into debt, companies build all kinds of stupid crap. You get this tissue fire, but like a tissue fire, burns bright, it burns fast. It goes out.
Yes.
Right? So every single time you get this cluster of business failures, that's what we call a recession, right? When a bunch of businesses fail at once, they lay off people, the unemployment rate goes up, right? So each time it's the same with this boom bust cycle. That does not exist in nature. And the reason is because businesses don't make a cluster of errors like that, right? Businesses are trying to make money. They're not trying to screw up. They're not trying to build a factory that nobody wants to buy, okay? So why is it that in 1 year you got a boom and everybody's making money and nobody's going bankrupt, and then 5 years later everybody is going bankrupt? Why do you get that cluster of errors? When you trace that out against the Fed, it is 1-to-1. The Fed drives that. Now, what's driving it at the moment, right, what's pushing the Fed towards easy money, no matter what's happening to the economy, is the federal spending, right? So they've got going on $2 trillion this year in deficits. When you pump that out into the market, somebody's got to buy that. And
right.
A huge amount of the treasury bills are bought by the Federal Reserve. So they print up money. They have, literally they sit in front of an Excel sheet and they type 100000. That is now money. Whatever they type into the Excel sheet is considered money. It is a counterfeiting operation. It's a licensed counterfeiter. And they take that money and they go out and lend it to the government. Right. And then what they get in return is a government bond, a treasury.
And it didn't exist before that process started.
It didn't exist. And then the government turns around, they hand it to a migrant or whatever. Somehow it gets out into the economy. They have poured water into the wine of your dollars. Right. So those new fake dollars are now competing with the dollars that you had to get up early in the morning, kiss your kids goodbye and go to work for.
Yeah.
That is now being diluted by all those new dollars. Now, during COVID, the Fed, the money supply, right, the amount of dollars in existence increased by 7 trillion. That was about $1 in $3 had fresh ink on it. It just been printed up in the Fed's basement, right? So that was a 40% increase in the money supply. Lo and behold, prices took off, right? And then you got the White House out here with, we got Mr. Putin and we got the oil and we got the boat in the Suez Canal. They're coming up with every excuse they got.
Right.
No, fundamentally, inflation is money printing.
So Peter, let me stop you there. It's Peter St Onge. Go and follow him, peterstonge.com, @Prof St Onge. I've got probably 3-4 minutes left, but I want to throw this in there. Should somebody come into office next year other than who we have now, let's say, could he decide to take trillions out of circulation and rebolster and re-strengthen the American dollar?
Yeah, well, the fastest way to do that is get rid of the deficit. So balance the budget. You could maybe cut back on the wars, cut back on the handouts on the migrants.
But is it literally about the money the tangible dollars in my wallet, the money we can touch? If we take that out of circulation, would that not make the other money that I have worth more?
Bingo. Exactly. Yeah. Right. You would end inflation in a stroke. You could even get some healthy deflation where your dollar is worth more.
Wow. It is Peter St Onge. All of this is so confusing because they literally are teaching people, even in so-called higher education, the opposite of what's true. So they make this nefarious deal back in 1913 or whatever it is, and the Federal Reserve exists. Is it really a private organization that the government really has no control over? Really?
They intentionally created it as a quasi-private organization. So they pretend it's government. They got the government seal on it. Yeah. But I give you an example. You cannot get a Freedom of Information Act enforced against the Federal Reserve because they say it's private.
Wow.
So it's very cute. They want to be federal when it helps them. They want to be private when it helps them. And, Ron Paul said there is less oversight over the Fed than there is over the CIA. There is no oversight. Ron Paul used to sit in Congress and he'd say, Chairman Bernanke, it was at the time, he'd say, what are you guys doing with this? How much money have you lost on that? Bernanke would say, I'm not answering that. He doesn't have to because it's a private organization. It is very cute how they play that game.
But aren't they appointed?
They're appointed. Some of the members are appointed. It is Baroque and it is intentionally complicated so that you can't understand it. Some of the members are appointed by the president. Most of them are appointed by banks. The Federal Reserve actually has shares that are owned by banks, but then the banks are required by the government to be a member. I mean, it is cute how they structured this, and they very much structured it so that they will be, whenever it's convenient, they're government. Whenever it's convenient, they're private.
It is Baroque and it's broke. It's Peter St Onge, peterstonge.com. Go there. He's a great economist. I've got to ask you about the trade tariffs in the last couple of minutes I have with you here. Yep. I thought that what Trump did was smart because China was already being extremely unfair with us when it came to trade. And we, for some reason, called them most favored nation. And we kissed the ring and we acted like it was okay that you couldn't sell a Chevrolet in China. But we had all this Chinese stuff over here. So Trump puts on the tariffs. Biden complains about it on the campaign trail. Everybody on the left complains about it. Trump is a fascist. Now Biden not only extended it, he made them even stiffer. So what are your thoughts on this whole rigmarole that we're watching when it comes to tariffs?
Yeah, so I think there's a big difference between Trump and Biden, which is that Trump understands that trade is useful, Okay.
Yes.
The most important thing about trade is that, like, you want cheap Chinese stuff so that you can use that to build cheap Fords, and then
Right.
you can export Fords, right? So trade is wonderful as long as you're building something in this country. And Trump's goal with the tariffs was always to pressure China, which does trade unfairly,
Yeah.
was to pressure China into not discriminating against American products so that we can have more trade, but we can have healthy trade. All right. So his was a means to an end. Put pressure on now so the Chinese play fair, and then we can all trade together. Biden's a very different deal. What Biden's doing is carrying water for unions. So he wants to ban Chinese. He doesn't care what that's going to do to our economy. He's not interested in the inputs. He's not interested in healthy trade going both directions. What he's doing is just pure cynicism. So, yes, the media went after Trump over the tariffs because, of course, they missed the point. And Trump said this over and over. He said, I'm going to play hardball with them so they straighten out, and then we can all be friends again. That is not what's happening with Biden. Biden just wants to shut them out so he can pay back the unions for the millions they gave him during his failed election bid.
Crazy. It is Peter St Onge. Go to petersaintonge.com. I appreciate the time and the knowledge. Give me maybe 30 seconds, 45 seconds on what you would advise a Gen Z person to do facing the economic trauma that we're seeing right now.
It's tough for Gen Z. You got inflation, you got low wages. Most important thing is don't lose hope. I know it looks remote that you can ever afford a house, you can ever build a future, but if you don't start now, you are going to regret it in the future. It's getting harder and harder. So save what you can. Live at home if you have to. Save on rent. You got a tough road ahead, though.
I appreciate the knowledge. I appreciate the time. Let's do it again very soon. petersaintonge.com. Visiting fellow economics over at the Heritage Foundation. Follow him at Prof. St Onge over on X. Peter, thank you. Appreciate you.
Always a pleasure, Joe.
All right, brother. We're back after this. Stay right here.